October 10th, 2013. The quarterly analyst call was unremarkable by Wall Street standards. Kenneth Frazier, Merck's CEO, announced the company would cut 8,500 jobs, following 7,500 cuts the year before. Combined, roughly 1 in 5 people who still worked for Merck anywhere on Earth. No one in Rahway, New Jersey, held a protest. The news rippled through the financial media and dissolved within 48 hours. The cuts were expected. They were priced in. That was precisely the problem, that they had become so routine, so thoroughly anticipated by everyone except the people being cut, that they no longer registered as the event they actually were. A slow-motion dismantling of the institution that had made New Jersey the pharmaceutical capital of the world. Merck did not collapse. Companies that collapse dramatically generate documentaries and congressional hearings. Merck restructured, optimized, consolidated. It reported earnings that satisfied analysts. By every conventional measure, it remained a success. And yet something irreplaceable happened during those years, something understanding it requires going back to a laboratory in New Jersey in the autumn of 1943, when the world's deadliest infectious disease was still winning. The concentration of drug companies along the northeastern corridor of New Jersey, from Rahway down through New Brunswick, Princeton, and toward Wilmington, reflected a specific logic that operated across nearly a century of industrial geography. Proximity to New York provided capital, talent, and connectivity to international markets. The density of research universities along what became known as Route 1 created a pipeline of trained scientists. The state's chemical and manufacturing infrastructure, built originally for other industries, proved adaptable to pharmaceutical production. And once a few major companies established themselves, the logic became self-reinforcing. Talent attracted companies. Companies attracted more talent. And the cluster accumulated momentum that made it nearly impossible to replicate elsewhere. By the early 20th century, New Jersey had earned its nickname as the medicine chest of the world, and this was not promotional language invented by a tourism board. It was an accurate description of where the drugs keeping people alive were being conceived, tested, and manufactured. Merck's Rahway campus, which opened in 1903, became a major site for chemical and antibiotic production. The campus was not simply a factory in the way that word is commonly understood. It was a place where basic science met industrial scale, where discoveries made in university laboratories were transformed into medicines that could be produced in quantities large enough to reach millions of patients. As recently as 2006, the state's pharmaceutical workforce totaled nearly 69,000 employees. That same year, the overall economic impact of the pharmaceutical and medical technology sector topped $27 billion in a state whose gross domestic product approached $465 billion. These were not marginal numbers. They represented a structural dependency, the kind of relationship between an industry and a region that, when it begins to fray, does not simply create inconvenience, but removes something foundational from the economic architecture of an entire place. In 2011, New Jersey was home to the world or North American headquarters of 17 of the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies on Earth. This concentration had developed over a century and reflected the accumulated value of what economists call agglomeration effects, the benefits that accrue to companies and workers when similar firms cluster together, creating shared labor markets, supplier networks, and informal information exchanges. The New Jersey pharmaceutical cluster was one of the most powerful examples of this phenomenon in American industrial history. In 1943, tuberculosis was still killing approximately 3 million people per year worldwide. It had been doing this at varying rates for centuries. The disease had a peculiarly democratic brutality. It moved through crowded cities and rural settlements with equal efficiency. It killed the young and the middle-aged with particular enthusiasm, and it had defeated every therapeutic approach that science had so far attempted. Sanatoriums existed throughout the United States and Europe, vast institutional structures where patients were sent not to be cured, but to be managed, to rest in thin mountain air and wait to see whether their lungs would hold. Selman Waksman and his students at Rutgers University established the first systematic screening protocols to detect antimicrobial agents produced by microorganisms. Unlike the serendipitous discovery of penicillin, which came through a chance observation by Alexander Fleming, Waksman's approach was methodical, a conscious industrial-scale search through the microbial world for substances that could be weaponized against human pathogens. Merck and Company had given Waksman's laboratory a research grant as early as 1939 in exchange for rights to any processes developed, creating one of the earliest and most productive partnerships between a university scientist and a pharmaceutical company in American history. Streptomycin, isolated in 1943, was the world's first broad-spectrum antibiotic. It attacked diverse pathogens, including those causing plague, cholera, typhoid, tularemia, and dysentery, infections entirely unaffected by penicillin, and, above all, it was the first practical treatment active against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, then the world's largest single infectious killer. When animal trials confirmed the drug's efficacy and clinical tests in human patients produced results that the Mayo Clinic researchers described as remarkable, the announcement represented one of those genuine inflection points in medical history. A disease that had seemed permanent suddenly had an expiration date. Merck's role was not peripheral to this story. The Rahway scientists provided both the material for testing and the industrial expertise to translate a laboratory compound into a manufacturable medicine. When streptomycin needed to be produced at scale, not in the quantities a university laboratory could generate, but in the quantities a world in the grip of tuberculosis required. It was Merck's industrial apparatus that made this possible. Maurice Hilleman, who joined Merck in 1957, proceeded to accomplish what no individual scientist in history had accomplished before or has accomplished since. Over the course of his career at the company's New Jersey operations, he developed 8 vaccines for measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, chickenpox, meningitis, and pneumonia. The incidence of rubella-associated birth defects, which had run as high as 10,000 per year in the United States, fell to 0 in the aftermath of the rubella vaccine's introduction. 8 vaccines. A single scientist at a single company on a single New Jersey campus. The number is difficult to process without sitting with it. Each vaccine represented not just a scientific achievement, but a practical reduction in the sum total of human suffering, measured in millions of deaths that did not occur and millions of childhoods that were not cut short. George W. Merck, describing the company's philosophy in a speech that became one of the most quoted statements in American corporate history, said simply, "We try to remember that medicine is for the patient. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow. And if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear." This statement would later be invoked in debates about what the company had become, whether the institution that now bore the Merck name still honored the spirit of the institution that had made streptomycin available to the world. Understanding what Merck built at its height requires understanding what made the pharmaceutical business model of the mid-20th century so extraordinarily durable. The company was not merely making medicines. It was operating within a system of structural protection that allowed it to translate scientific investment into financial returns with a reliability that almost no other industry could match. The patent system was the foundation. A successful drug patent gave its owner exclusive rights to manufacture and sell a compound for a defined period, time enough to recoup the enormous costs of research and clinical development and generate profits sufficient to fund the next generation. For companies with Merck's scientific capabilities, this system functioned exactly as designed. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Merck's R&D investment grew threefold, and the company became the largest pharmaceutical firm in the world. The vertically integrated model that Merck had constructed in New Jersey gave the company control over every stage of this process. Discovery happened in the research laboratories on the Rahway campus. Development happened in the clinical and regulatory groups that could translate a promising molecule into an FDA submission. Manufacturing happened in the industrial facilities that could produce drugs at the scale required for a global market. And the accumulated expertise at each stage reinforced expertise at every other stage. Chemists who worked near engineers, who worked near clinicians, in the kind of proximity that allows informal knowledge transfer to happen constantly, at every lunch table and in every hallway conversation. This proximity was not incidental. It was, in retrospect, one of the most important and underappreciated assets in Merck's competitive position, and one of the assets that would prove most difficult to preserve as the logic of cost reduction began to reshape the company's geography. But there was a structural vulnerability embedded in this apparent strength. The entire system depended on a continuous flow of new patent-protected drugs to replace the revenue lost when older patents expired. If that flow slowed, if the productivity of pharmaceutical research declined, if the cost of clinical development increased, if regulators raised the bar for approval, the financial case for maintaining the expensive integrated model would weaken dramatically. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, all three of these things began to happen simultaneously. The pharmaceutical industry's productivity problem did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived gradually, disguised by intermittent successes and consistent corporate optimism, visible in retrospect with the clarity of hindsight that was frustratingly absent in the moment. The cost of bringing a new drug to market had been rising for decades, driven by increasingly rigorous regulatory requirements, the growing complexity of the diseases being targeted, and the declining availability of simple drug targets that earlier generations of researchers had already addressed. The era of the blockbuster antibiotic and the easily synthesized small molecule was giving way to the era of biologics and targeted therapies that required entirely different scientific toolkits. Merck was not uniquely positioned to see this coming, but its particular vulnerability was real. The company had built its identity, its culture, its compensation structures, its recruitment narrative around the idea that it was the most scientifically rigorous pharmaceutical company in the world. This identity had been accurate and valuable for decades, but it had also created an institutional psychology poorly suited to recognizing that the scientific environment had changed in ways that required a fundamentally different approach. The Vioxx crisis of 2004 crystallized these vulnerabilities catastrophically. Vioxx, a widely prescribed pain medication, was withdrawn from global markets after data emerged suggesting it significantly elevated the risk of heart attack and stroke in patients using it long-term. The drug had generated billions in revenue and was one of Merck's primary financial pillars. Its withdrawal came with enormous legal liability, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational damage. Legal settlements alone ran to billions. The market capitalization loss was larger still. Rather than triggering a fundamental reassessment of how the company was organized, the crisis accelerated trends already present. A push toward cost reduction, manufacturing rationalization, and the kinds of financial discipline that can be presented to investors as evidence of prudent management, while actually representing the early stages of strategic retreat. March 9th, 2009. The financial world was already in shock. Lehman Brothers had collapsed 6 months earlier. The global economy was in free fall, and pharmaceutical companies were watching their stock prices move in ways that seemed unrelated to their underlying businesses. Merck announced it had agreed to pay $41 billion for fellow New Jersey-based drug firm Schering-Plough. The deal came only 6 weeks after Pfizer announced its acquisition of New Jersey-based Wyeth Pharmaceuticals. The coincidence of timing was not accidental. Both mega-mergers reflected the same diagnosis. Individual large pharmaceutical companies could not sustain the research investment required to replace revenue from drugs approaching patent expiration. The solution, combining two large companies with overlapping research programs, redundant manufacturing infrastructure, and duplicate administrative functions, would generate cost savings needed to survive the transition. Whether it would generate the scientific productivity required to thrive was a different question, and one that received considerably less attention. The post-merger cuts were announced with the bureaucratic precision characteristic of industrial restructuring. Approximately 16,000 jobs would be eliminated from the combined workforce. This followed separate internal restructurings already underway at both companies. For New Jersey, whose pharmaceutical employment already showed signs of strain, this was not simply a number, it was a forecast. Two of the state's largest employers, headquartered within miles of each other, were about to be integrated through a process designed explicitly to eliminate duplicate functions. And in industries where one company has a research laboratory and the other has a research laboratory, integration means closure. Between 2010 and 2015, Merck cut around 36,450 jobs globally. That 5-year figure deserves a moment of reflection. It is a number large enough to populate a small city. It represents not just paychecks, but career trajectories, pension contributions, health benefits, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of people who had spent years or decades learning to do specific things at a high level of competence. When they left, that knowledge did not stay in New Jersey. Much of it dispersed to other states, other countries, and other industries. The emphasis on manufacturing in these successive rounds of cuts was significant. When the former Schering-Plough headquarters in Kenilworth was reorganized, pharmaceutical packaging operations were moved to facilities in Wilson, North Carolina, Cleveland, Tennessee, Montreal, and Singapore. Singapore. That single destination in that sentence contains an entire economic history. The operations moving to Singapore were not the product of a dramatic strategic decision. They were the incremental result of a cost comparison that found production cheaper elsewhere, combined with improvements in global logistics that made the distance manageable. No single decision was unreasonable. The sum of all the decisions was devastating. In the 2 decades following 2000, New Jersey went from having more than 20% of U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturing jobs to less than 10%. This figure is the kind of statistic that should have generated sustained public alarm. A halving of market share in a defining industry within 2 decades is not a fluctuation or a cyclical adjustment. It is a structural transformation. And yet the response from New Jersey's political and business establishment during the period when this transformation was occurring was characteristically muted, marked more by hope and denial than by the kind of urgent intervention that the scale of the change might have seemed to require. The pattern was compounding. Every merger involving New Jersey-headquartered companies produced the same result: rationalization, consolidation, and the net reduction of New Jersey headcount in the service of combined entity cost savings. The state was not simply losing jobs at one company. It was losing jobs at multiple companies simultaneously, in a coordinated fashion driven by the same underlying logic of merger economics. Each consolidation reduced the New Jersey footprint of the resulting company. The losses were permanent. The mathematical logic was inexorable. The physical evidence was hard to miss. Former research campuses that had once hummed with the activity of thousands of scientists became monuments to the transition, physical records of what had been present and was now absent. Roche's campus in Nutley, a sprawling research complex representing hundreds of millions in capital investment, sat largely empty for years after the company's withdrawal. These were not small buildings. Their vacancy was a message about what the market now thought of New Jersey as a location for pharmaceutical activity. A Rutgers University academic studying the trend offered a diagnosis that cut to the core of the structural problem. The new innovation in biotech and genomics was happening elsewhere, in places where there were graduate educational institutions with research faculty driving cutting-edge work. New Jersey had not developed that ecosystem in sufficient depth. The cluster had been built around large company pharmaceutical research, not around the university spin-out, venture capital-funded model of biotechnology that was increasingly driving the industry's frontier. When that model came to dominate, the states best positioned to benefit were those with the strongest university research ecosystems: Massachusetts, California, North Carolina, not New Jersey. It is tempting to frame the loss of pharmaceutical manufacturing jobs in New Jersey as an inevitable consequence of globalization, the same process that moved textile production to Southeast Asia or automobile assembly to Mexico. The temptation should be resisted. Pharmaceutical manufacturing is not like other manufacturing in ways that matter enormously. The production of medicines to FDA quality standards involves an extraordinarily complex knowledge system. It is not a matter of following a recipe. It requires deep understanding of how active pharmaceutical ingredients behave under varying conditions, how manufacturing processes can be validated to ensure consistency across millions of doses, how regulatory documentation must be structured and maintained to pass inspection, and how problems, contamination events, yield anomalies, equipment failures must be identified, investigated, and corrected without compromising product quality. This knowledge is not codified in a manual. It lives in people, in the experienced validation engineers, quality control scientists, manufacturing technicians, and regulatory specialists who have spent careers developing the tacit understanding that separates pharmaceutical manufacturing from pharmaceutical manufacturing done badly. When these people leave through layoffs or relocation, the knowledge leaves with them. It does not transfer automatically to the new location. It must be rebuilt, slowly and expensively, through the accumulation of new experience in a new place. The pharmaceutical supply chain vulnerabilities that became visible to the American public during the COVID-19 pandemic were not created in 2020. They were created incrementally, over 2 decades, by exactly the process that occurred in New Jersey. The concentration of generic drug manufacturing in India and China, a concentration that created serious supply disruptions when global supply chains were stressed, reflected decisions made in corporate boardrooms throughout the 2000s and 2010s, when cost optimization was the dominant organizational value and the resilience arguments for domestic manufacturing seemed abstract and theoretical. They are less abstract now. There is a psychological phenomenon that occurs in powerful institutions when they have been successful for a very long time. Success generates confidence. Confidence becomes assumption. Assumption hardens into ideology, and ideology resists evidence that the conditions generating the original success have changed in ways that make the original approach inadequate. Merck exhibited this pattern in ways that are instructive precisely because they were not unique to Merck. They were common across the large pharmaceutical companies that had dominated New Jersey's economy for decades. The belief that scale was a permanent advantage led to the pursuit of mergers that destroyed value rather than creating it. The belief that proprietary research capabilities were irreplaceable led to underinvestment in the external partnerships and biotech acquisitions that were generating the industry's most productive innovations. The belief that manufacturing efficiency could be achieved through consolidation and outsourcing without cost to the accumulated knowledge embedded in existing facilities led to a systematic hollowing out of the industrial base. A Harvard Business School analysis of New Jersey's pharmaceutical cluster, conducted in 2004, identified the core problem even then. Large pharmaceutical companies were a key strength to New Jersey, but their dominance had led to what the study called a muscle-bound economy that was not transforming itself fast enough. Other states were being creative and aggressive in attracting investment from pharmaceutical and medical technology companies. The concentration in one form of pharmaceutical activity, large company, integrated, vertically organized research and manufacturing, had made New Jersey's cluster brittle. The conditions that had made large companies choose New Jersey were changing, and the state had not developed the alternative capabilities that would make it attractive under a different set of conditions. The irony was rich and painful. The very dominance that made New Jersey's pharmaceutical sector look invincible in 2000, the concentration of headquarters, the density of established operations, the accumulated workforce and infrastructure, created the conditions for maximum disruption when the industry's economics shifted. Large companies have large overheads. Large overheads justify restructuring. Restructuring concentrates pain in the places where the operations are largest. The more firmly New Jersey was embedded in the identity of the pharmaceutical industry's established players, the more vulnerable it was to the consequences of those players' decisions. Merck's Rahway campus transitioned over the decades from an engineering, production, and industrial complex into a research-focused campus centered on chemistry and preclinical development. The campus did not disappear. It was renovated and repositioned. But what it became was fundamentally different from what it had been. And the difference mattered to New Jersey in ways that went beyond the raw job count. When Merck moved its headquarters back to Rahway in 2023, returning after 8 years in Kenilworth and 23 before that in White House Station, the company invested in a $450 million facility and presented the consolidation as a statement of commitment to the state. The campus, covering approximately 200 acres, became the centerpiece of Merck's claim to continued relevance in the place that had made it. More than 6,000 workers were based there. 6,000 is a meaningful number. It is also approximately 1/10 of the pharmaceutical workforce New Jersey employed when the industry was at its state-specific peak. The comparison is not entirely fair. Merck is one company among many, and New Jersey still hosts a substantial life sciences cluster by absolute measure. But the comparison is not entirely unfair either. The 6,000 people at Rahway are doing different work than the people who filled New Jersey's pharmaceutical campuses in 2006. More of them are in research and corporate functions. Fewer of them are in manufacturing. The physical production of the drugs that Merck sells, the pills and injections and biologics that will carry the company's revenue through the next decade, happens increasingly elsewhere. A filing with the New Jersey Department of Labor revealed that Merck planned to cut 204 positions at its Rahway headquarters between February and May 2026. This is the second round of layoffs to impact Merck's New Jersey operations in the recent period, part of a broader plan to eliminate 6,000 positions globally by the end of 2027. The restructuring is driven by the anticipated patent expiration of Keytruda in 2028, the cancer immunotherapy that has accounted for nearly half of Merck's pharmaceutical revenue. The cycle is familiar. A blockbuster drug approaches the end of its patent life. The revenue cliff appears on the horizon, the organization cuts costs, and New Jersey absorbs a disproportionate share of those cuts because New Jersey is where the historical concentration of Merck's operations remains. The company survives the transition with a smaller New Jersey footprint. The cycle begins again. States have economic identities the way companies do. These identities are not merely promotional constructs. They reflect real concentrations of capability, workforce, and institutional knowledge that make certain kinds of economic activity natural and sustainable in specific places. New Jersey's identity as the nation's medicine chest was real in this sense. It described an actual comparative advantage built over a century and provided the foundation for specific policy choices, infrastructure investments, and educational priorities. When that identity begins to erode, when the cluster that sustains it starts to fragment, when the companies that anchor it begin to hollow out their local operations, the response required is not simply economic, it is also psychological and political. It requires the recognition that the future cannot simply be an extension of the past, that the capabilities that made the state dominant under one set of conditions may not be the capabilities required for dominance under the next set. New Jersey's pharmaceutical and medical technology sector was battered through the 2000s and 2010s by a series of compounding pressures: a global recession that compressed investment, declining pharmaceutical stock prices, the development of fewer major new drugs, and the wave of patent expirations that eliminated revenue from the blockbuster drugs that had sustained company balance sheets for decades. Each of these pressures was real and external to the state's policy choices. But the aggregate response, a gradual acceptance that New Jersey was transitioning from pharmaceutical manufacturer to pharmaceutical headquarters city, and eventually perhaps to pharmaceutical historical reference, was not inevitable. It was a choice made through inaction as much as action. The physical vacancy of former pharmaceutical campuses tells the story more directly than any statistic. Buildings designed to house pharmaceutical research at scales requiring hundreds of millions in capital investment sat empty for years after their occupants departed. Real estate firms marketed them with language emphasizing their location near Manhattan and their proximity to transit, which was not the same as arguing that they remained relevant to the industry that had built them. New Jersey has not surrendered entirely. The state now hosts more than 5,600 life sciences establishments, employing approximately 115,000 people and contributing an estimated $121 billion in economic output. New Jersey-affiliated companies account for a remarkable share of novel FDA drug approvals in recent years. The state has 139 FDA-registered biopharma manufacturing facilities, the highest concentration in the United States. The biotech sector that was nascent in the 1990s has grown substantially, drawing on the deep pool of pharmaceutical talent that remained in the state after the large company restructurings displaced thousands of experienced scientists and engineers. But adaptation is not equivalence. The manufacturing knowledge base that New Jersey accumulated through a century of pharmaceutical production, the tacit expertise distributed across thousands of people who understood how to make medicines at scale, safely, and consistently, cannot be fully reconstructed through policy initiatives and real estate development. Some of it has been lost. How much has been lost will only be fully apparent when the next crisis reveals the gaps. The question that New Jersey faces, and that other states with similar histories of industrial concentration face in different industries, is whether the institutions that generated a century of comparative advantage can be meaningfully reconstructed once they have been substantially dismantled, or whether the knowledge, the relationships, and the physical infrastructure that supported them are the kind of thing that, Once lost, simply do not return. The title of this story refers to something specific. The decline of New Jersey's pharmaceutical capital status did not announce itself with the drama that its significance deserved. There were no shuttered factories with protesters outside, no congressional hearings featuring laid-off workers describing careers abruptly ended, no sustained public narrative about the strategic consequences of losing pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. Instead, there were quarterly earnings calls with cost savings announcements, press releases about restructuring programs designed to achieve synergies, and WARN notices filed quietly with the state labor department listing precise numbers of employees to be terminated between specific dates. The silence was not conspiratorial, it was structural. Companies restructuring in response to genuine competitive pressures are not obligated to narrate their actions as the decline of a regional economy. The obligation to make that narrative explicit falls to the journalists, academics, politicians, and public officials positioned to see the aggregate pattern that any single company's actions obscure. And for most of the period during which the transformation occurred, that narrative was not made explicit in the sustained, alarming way that the scale of the change would seem to have required. Every pharmaceutical manufacturing job that left New Jersey represented not just a paycheck, but a multiplier. The people who held these jobs spent money in local businesses, paid property taxes that funded local schools, contributed to pension systems that supported local economies long after their working years. Economists estimate that every direct pharmaceutical job supports 3 or more indirect jobs in services, construction, and retail. The losses were always larger than the headline job count suggested. George Merck said in 1950 that medicine is for the people. The pharmaceutical industry that New Jersey built over a century was, in its best moments, an attempt to make that statement operationally true, to translate the idealism of the laboratory into the physical reality of drugs that could reach patients who needed them. The Rahway campus, where that work happened, is still standing, still occupied, still doing science of genuine value. But the claim to primacy, the sense that this specific place was the center of something that mattered to the world's health, has been quietly negotiated away, one restructuring announcement at a time. In the language of efficiency and synergy and optimization, that is how modern corporations describe the things they are choosing to stop being. The medicine chest of the world is not empty, but someone has been moving things out of it for 20 years, and the inventory will never be quite the same.